Peter Woodburn is a blogger for the Slipper Still Fits, a Gonzaga Bulldogs community on SB Nation, and he now joins us here on Behind the Mic to talk all things Gonzaga. Peter, how are you tonight? Thanks for coming on. We appreciate the time.
I'm doing fantastic considering that I'm kind of in the middle of the best Gonzaga run of my fandom.
It's incredible, right? I mean, there were some doubts, I guess, from some certain corners whether or not a team that was a runner-up last year could get back again, because history tells us that's difficult to do, although look no further than North Carolina, who just did it last year and was able to win the whole thing the year before, the year prior, losing to Villanova. So who knows? This tournament's been crazy. Just right off the bat, Peter, what has been the biggest difference in this team from last year's version to this year's version?
I think, last year's version, those Bulldogs, they didn't end up in the national title game by accident. So they were definitively a better team than this year's team is. I don't think there's really any argument about that. But the one kind of big difference, I would say, between the two teams is last year's team played with a little bit more finesse, kind of comes with just having a better quality team. And this year's team is pretty gritty. I mean, those wins against UNC Greensboro and Ohio State, they were not pretty wins by any measure of the word. But they still, at the end of the game, they found out a way to win. And that's kind of been Gonzaga's MO this year, is that they can grind with the best of them, but they'll do what it takes to pull out the win.
Peter, I got a question for you. What's does Gonzaga have to do to stop Florida State's fast break? Because, Florida State's not known for half-court set. They're mainly a team that likes to go off a fast break and score. And does Gonzaga, do they have to slow the game down and kind of walk the ball up and pound it inside in order to beat a Florida State team who's mainly 90% of their points come from fast breaking?
I think that definitely the tempo of Florida State is going to be something that the Zags will have to adjust to. They haven't really played a team that plays as fast as Florida State does in quite a while. They definitely haven't played a team as deep as Florida State's rotation runs in probably the entire season. And so I think that Gonzaga can run with the best of teams, and I think having that long layover is really going to help them out because they'll have fresh legs. But I would really expect to see Gonzaga just really trying to slow Florida State down as much as possible with some pretty aggressive half-court defense. Gonzaga's not really a team that pulls out a press that much or anything. Their defense just relies on making it hard for the opponents to find a good shot. And so I think that you're really going to see Gonzaga making a concerted effort to crash the offensive glass, to try and get some extra rebounds, but also making sure that they get back on defense, because otherwise Florida State's going to just be able to run them off the floor with as many players as they pull out.
Peter, Mark Few continues to be an extremely underrated head coach throughout college basketball. He's got to be now considered in the echelon of some of these guys who've been around a long time, right? I mean, the likes of Jay Wright, John Calipari. I think he's in that realm. Obviously, the only difference is he hasn't won a championship yet, but just based off of all the upsets we've seen here this tournament, Few continues to be a constant for this team, and he's been there, done that. And again, there's just one thing missing from the resume, and that's a championship. But do you think he's made that leap now into that upper echelon realm of head coaches?
Yeah, I think that he has, because I think that, like a lot of good head coaches, Mark Few, kind of what he made Gonzaga known for in the first place was getting a little bit more out of the players that he had than maybe other coaches would. And so the old Gonzaga teams, in 1999, the team that started the run, it was a team of good basketball players, but by no means in the grand scheme of things were they as good as they actually were to make the Elite Eight. They just played above and beyond what their level was. And Mark Few has a history of being able to kind of pull that energy out of his players and pull that teamwork that's required out of those players and to make those teams play in a consistent manner like that. And so I think that, when you kind of consider the resources that Gonzaga has, which is a lot for a small school like that, but also, pales in comparison to any of the other blue blood schools and what he's been able to do at Gonzaga. I think that he definitely deserves to be just thrown up there with all of those best coaches. And just because he hasn't won a national title, I think that'll come eventually. Getting the Final Four off the back was nice, but I think that he has done as good of a job as anybody could ever do at Gonzaga. And I think you take any of the other top coaches in the nation, you put them in Gonzaga, and it would be hard for them to replicate what Mark Few has done. It's really been a special run for him.
Hey, Peter, who's going to oppose in terms of who is the X factor for the Zags in order to get the job done this upcoming tomorrow? Actually, they play tomorrow, correct?
Yep.
So tomorrow is because I was looking around at their roster. I'm thinking of Josh Perkins was that guy that really has to perform well because he can match up pretty much to the guard play and the forwards. Those forwards that they have. But who do you think is because you've been following this team for a while, who is the X factor for this team to actually succeed and see themselves in the Elite Eight?
I think that, prior to when the tournament was starting, I was going to say that it would be either Zach Norvell or Rui Hachimura. And both of those players have they had really, really great starts to the NCAA tournament. And so now I don't feel like they're necessarily the X factors anymore because they're the guys that made their names for themselves on the national stage in these first two games. And so I think that the X factor tomorrow is going to be the starting forward, Killian Tilly, who has he had an absolutely killer WCC conference tournament. I think at one point he hit 10 consecutive three-pointers over the course of two games. He shot like 75% from long range. He shot like 65% from the floor, and he was just demolishing the competition. But through the two games, the first round, the second round in the NCAA tournament, he's been a little bit hampered by foul trouble. And he's a player that can really stretch opposing defenses. He has a great outside shot. He's crafty in the post, and he is a really, really solid rebounder. And so I think that he hasn't really gotten going in this tournament yet, and I would like to see him get a little bit of that juice flowing that he had going throughout the year.
Peter Woodburn joining us from SB Nation here on Behind the Mic. Let's take a look now at the bottom half of the West Region bracket. Michigan taking on Texas A&M, Peter. Both these teams have been impressive, to say the least, in this tournament. Michigan probably fortunate to be here after Poole's miracle shot over Houston, which probably is the moment of the tournament for me. Honestly, I can't get over how miraculous of a shot that was in a moment of the tournament. That was incredible in itself. But, they're going to take on an Aggies team who I thought had the best half of basketball of any team I saw in the tournament to date against the Tar Heels on Sunday. The way they played that first half to establish a lead, to really, they never look back from that point on the rest of the way. Two great teams. How do you see this one playing out? Obviously, if Gonzaga is able to beat Florida State, they'll take on the winner of one of these two teams. The Wolverines, Aggies, what do you see in this one?
Yeah, you hit it. Like the Aggies in their last game, I think that maybe outside of Clemson against Auburn, that was probably the finest, just like kind of half of basketball that anyone has ever played. And I think that a lot of people forget that they were ranked really, really high earlier in the year, and then they kind of fell apart a little and dropped out of the rankings, and that's kind of why they got their lower seed. But the fact of the matter is it doesn't really matter if you go in with a lower seed. All that matters is that you figure it out at the right time. And the Aggies really look like that they're figuring it out at the right time. And they're just a physically imposing squad. And I think that, Michigan's a great team, but Michigan also has had to fight tooth and nail to get to where they're at right now. So I would really kind of expect the Aggies to kind of prevail in that match. But, it's been a long layover since Saturday for the last game. So if Michigan's had time to prevail, or Michigan's had time to kind of plan for what the Aggies, like physicality and everything, is going to bring. I think that game's kind of a toss-up, but I'm leaning towards Texas A&M.
Hey, let me ask you this. I mean, because I think Texas A&M. I think if Texas A&M, I had told Brad earlier, if Texas A&M had, if they have a lead, at least a 10-point lead or so, I don't think Michigan's going to come back from that. I think Michigan needs to keep it close for the fact that, because Texas A&M, like you said, they are a physical team and they're big. Do you think Gonzaga and Texas A&M, if they do meet up, what do you see in that game in terms of matchups, and who do you think will end up coming out on top?
I mean, in terms of matchups, I think in that game it's definitely going to be a battle of the front lines, and I think that in that regard, it's really kind of a toss-up because both teams have great interior presences, and they both kind of play it a little bit differently. I mean, Texas A&M, they play a much more physical style, and Gonzaga kind of relies a little bit on finesse. And I think that the one advantage that the Aggies might have there is that they have a little bit more depth in that regard. Gonzaga runs a pretty tight ship this NCAA tournament. I mean, they're basically running a six-man rotation with the occasional appearance of Corey Kispert for a few minutes here and there. And they have some bigs that they can fall back on, a redshirt freshman and Jacob Larson. But really the bigs for Gonzaga are Jonathan Williams, Killian Tilly, and Rui Hachimura. And none of those three are really traditional kind of post-center player. They all operate a little bit farther away from the rim, kind of have to bully their way in. And that gets tougher when you're dealing with larger front lines. So I think that would be the really key matchup in the game. And that's probably, if those two teams meet, I think that's how it would be decided.
Gonzaga and Nevada, the last two West Coast teams remaining standing in this tournament, just like we chalked it up, right? Yep. It's been crazy, so hard to predict. What has been the storyline? There's been so many in this tournament, Peter, but what's the one that you've enjoyed the most?
Yeah, I think that I was with everybody in just the UMBC over Virginia. For a very long time, I've always thought that eventually a number 16 seed was going to beat a number 1 seed. I always thought that it was going to be more on a buzzer-beating 3 or some crazy shot or just something like that. I did not ever expect it to just be the full-blown second-half trouncing that existed. But for me personally, I'm going to go out a little bit of a limb, and that's just because I have a bunch of friends that went to Nevada. And the route that the Nevada Wolfpack have taken to get to the Sweet 16 is rather crazy. They were down by, I think, 14 against Texas before pulling it out in OT. And then the only time that they won in that game, or the only time they led in that game against Cincinnati, was literally by the final score. And that 22-point comeback was it was just unreal, just watching it unfold in real time. And it's actually such a bummer that Nevada has to go up against Loyola Chicago, because that's, of course, the other really great storyline. And it's really a shame that those are the two teams that are facing off against each other, and one has to advance and one goes home. But, I mean, you've said it. This has been one of the craziest NCAA tournament first weekends that I can ever remember, and I'm really hoping that the rest of the tournament holds true to that.
Oh, it's got to be, right?
Yeah, it absolutely has to be. And I have one more question for you. Who, out the South, the West, the East, the Midwest, who will win the national championship?
Well, I think it's going to be Villanova, and I'm saying this because earlier this year I traveled all the way to New York from Seattle to go see Gonzaga play Villanova at the Jimmy V Classic at Madison Square Garden. It was my first time at the Garden. I was super stoked. I thought Gonzaga could hang a little bit, and Villanova just went out there and just surgically dismantled them by like 25 points or something like that. And Nova's offense is just scary when it gets going, and I don't think that there's a single team that can really be able to shut that down at all. I think the only team that maybe had a chance at shutting that down would have been Virginia, and since they're nowhere on the map anymore, I picked Villanova as my tournament champions in my bracket, and I'm going to stand by that one.
Okay.
I like it. You got to stick by it. Villanova's still a hot pick. I'll tell you what, if we go to Villanova-Duke Final Four, that could be an all-time classic, potentially.
Yes.
With how well those two teams have played. I mean, they have been the most impressive, especially with Virginia going down. Duke, Villanova, they have stood tall so far in this tournament. Go ahead, Keith.
I got one more thing. When you look at the tournament and what's the games that are playing this week, of course you're covering, Gonzaga and Florida State, but what's that next game that you think people should tune into and watch very closely?
I'm always one for the underdogs. That's why I love Gonzaga in the first place, and I'm going to go with that Nevada and Loyola Chicago game because I think it's two teams that are just going to be having the time of their life. Everyone else has really been in the Sweet 16 before, and for those two teams, I think that's going to be the game where you're going to see the players probably playing the hardest out of all 16 teams that are in the tournament still, and so I think that's really going to be an entertaining game.
There we go. Great stuff. Just totally killing it there. The Slipper Still Fits blog. Check it out on SB Nation. I love it. Peter Woodburn, thank you so much. We appreciate the time tonight, and perhaps maybe we'll be talking to you in a couple weeks again, celebrating a Gonzaga championship. Who knows?
That would be the best. Thanks, guys.
There he goes once again. Peter Woodburn joining us here on Behind the Mic.